And did you guys get a notice saying I'm recording? Okay, good. Okay, well, welcome to our second boat maintenance series. This one, Darrell and I decided we'd go into some longer term things. The last session, for those who were able to join, were just regular winterizing and summarizing. This one's more about long-term things that you might overlook. So I'm going to focus on several of those that I came across on the Westerbeek. And as always, I have to stress that I'm going to be giving you in the context of the Westerbeek. Darrell's got far broader experience than I have, so I can give you some other examples. So forgive me for being single-minded, but it's all I know. So with that, I'll get going. The other caveat is there's so much to cover in all of this stuff. We'll only really scrape the surface. This is a book I talked about in the last presentation. I do recommend it if you are interested in maintenance. It's been a Bible for me, and it really carries a huge amount of useful information. It's a massive book. If you need ballast on your boat, suggest you have it on the boat, but otherwise, it's really interesting. So I've said at the bottom, these sessions are intended only to provide an awareness of what can and should be done to keep a boat safe. Okay, so longer term maintenance items. Same slide as last time. I just wanted to review the main systems on a diesel. You've got the mechanics of it, the pistons and the mechanical frame and everything. You've got the electrical system, obviously, to start it and stop it, and generators and so on. You've then got what's called a raw water system, which is otherwise known as seawater, which comes in. And for many boats, not all, but most boats now have a separate system, a coolant system. And so a little like your car has a radiator and it uses air to cool it, which is what the raw water is doing here. It then has a separate coolant system. You then got the engine with the oil and the gearbox, and then finally you've got the fuel. So we'll be focusing mostly on the fuel today. I've repeated this slide again just to remind folks that looking at your engine specs is so important. A lot of people sort of don't just skim over them. They contain a wealth of information. If you plan to do any maintenance like this, they include things like the torque you have to have on your fuel injectors and other critical items. So I can't stress enough, it really is good. And it also includes somewhere in the maintenance how often you should maintain things. And to give you an idea on the fuel injectors on Zanzibar, they say they should be serviced every 500 hours. Well, Zanzibar has now done 2,500 hours. I've never changed them, and I've probably put 500 hours on that. I'm sure they were never serviced before. So it's well overdue what needs to be serviced on the fuel injectors. And what motivated me to want to do this, other than the fact the boat's been on the hard for a year now, was that when I started the boat, it was pretty smoky. It was coming up with a cloud of smoke for about 30 seconds. A little bit of research, and people said that can be an indication of the fuel injectors needing servicing. Could be something else as well, but most of the things where they say the color of the smoke and how long it lasts, that seemed to be a good place to start. And also the advice was start there, get the fuel injector service first, and then see what other problems you have. No point in diving into something worse like compression before you've done the basics. So that was my motivation. So again, we've talked a lot in the last session about annual maintenance. Here I wanted to highlight 3 areas that were brought to my attention soon after I bought the boat. I was going out one day with one of my common crew who sails with me very often. I was showing him how to keep up his scan, to use flying terms, where as you're looking ahead and looking where you're going, you should also watch your instruments, obviously your navigation instruments, but also you need to include in your scan your engine instruments. Keep an eye on things like your oil pressure, your temperature, and your fuel, and those kinds of things, RPM. So they should be included in your scan. He was starting to do this and getting the hang of it. And then he said to me, well, Alex, you said to me the temperature should be about 180 on this. It seems to be going up 190 and climbing. What's up with that? And I thought, well, that was strange. I'd never seen that before. We got the boat back fine. It wasn't a disaster, but it was obviously running hotter than usual. And so just happened to be at the time of the boat show, and I asked the Westerbeek service manager on the boat show, the Newport boat show stand, what he thought about that. And he said, oh, there's 3 things you need to check, because the boat at that time had done about 2,000 hours. He said, check your raw water pump flow, make sure your raw water pump is working properly. Check your exhaust elbow integrity. I've used the word integrity, but basically the exhaust elbow is where the hot gases from the engine meets raw salt water coming from the cooling system. And what could be a worse corrosive situation than having extremely hot gases mixing with seawater, cold seawater? So he said, check the integrity of that, and then check your heat exchanger condition. And what he meant by that is, with this many hours on it, it's not just a case of looking at it and putting in a new zinc. It's a case of, he recommended taking off the heat exchanger and sending it to a certified shop, a proper shop, to get it pressure tested and cleaned, and if necessary, put in an acid bath, as some people do with radiators on their cars. So the quick story there was that the raw water pump flow, they told me afterwards, had completely worn down. There's a cam inside that I'll show you in a bit. And that essentially wasn't pumping now any effectively. So there wasn't adequate water. And if I looked at the exhaust and if I checked it with a bucket for the flow rate, I would have seen the flow rate was low. So that was the main cause of the overheating. The exhaust elbow, he said, don't even bother telling me about that. You're going to throw that one away and we're going to sell you a new one, because at 2,500 hours or 2,000 hours, sorry, at that time, it's not worth doing anything with it. Just get a new one. And then the heat exchanger, he said, yes, send it to us. And it wasn't a lot of money. I don't remember, a few $100s, but they cleaned it. They put it in a bath. They did wonderful things to it. And it came back looking like new. So all of those things were done beforehand. So here's now going through these various elements. Here's the raw water pump. Inside it is a cam. And that piece which I pointed to here, the raw water pump itself is circular. Machine circular. This cam makes it non-circular, so it fills up some of the space, and that's what makes the impeller blades compress. You can imagine this top blade is not going to have as much room to stretch out, so it has to bend and compress, and then when it comes down, it fills out, and that's how that works. As this cam slowly gets worn away just through time, even though it's neoprene on bronze or something, it does get flattened and gets thinner and thinner. So essentially, they replaced the cam and did some other magic. I don't exactly know what. Before I move on, I just want to go back to that. And Darrell, any additional comments you'd like to make on that one?
Yeah, if you want to just back up to the pump for a second, show us that pump. Yeah. See the two bearings, the ball bearings. Believe it or not, some pumps don't have ball bearings that are mounted to the engine, and they have just a carbon bush for a bearing, and so those tend to wear out, and I don't even know what lubricates that, frankly. But some older Westerbeeks and Universals have those, and I think Alan's boat actually has one. He's got a big, 50-horse engine even. And he had one of his pumps fail on him a couple of years ago, and it started leaking right into the engine.
Oh,
that's how he got salt water in his engine and wound up having to get a total rebuild on that. That's all.
Oh, wow. Okay. So then, just to highlight, so these components, the raw water pump is not on this slide. It's somewhere down here, just out of sight. Here's the elbow, just so you recognize what you're looking at. And you're looking at the engine from the top starboard, rear starboard side. So on my boat, anyway, this is the bow up here. So this is the whole elbow that's completely replaced. And then this is the heat exchanger. And the heat exchanger on my boat has one pencil, which we were just talking about a little earlier, which is here, and I replace it. Now, if you don't replace the pencil early enough and it disintegrates, what will happen is you have a bunch of zinc stuck in the bottom of your heat exchanger, which is okay. It's not going to break anything or do anything wrong, but it is going to reduce the flow on the heat exchanger. If you do this for several pencils and don't bother to clean it out, then it is going to clog it up. These end plates on the, again, I'm afraid I'm going to be just simply referring to the Westerbeek. I can't speak for yours. I'm sure Darrell can help here in a minute. But you undo this one bolt, you can pull off the plate, and you can literally go in there with a screwdriver or a pair of pliers or needle nose and pull out all the junk. And that's what I did here. But I would recommend going to the earlier point about someone saying they lose their pencils quite frequently. I like to pull mine out often enough that I'm confident that it isn't past, say, 50%. I don't want it disintegrating in here. Darrell, any additional comments you'd like to add?
Maybe somebody else wants to kick in, but all I have to say right here is that, we have Ken's recent emails telling about his heat exchanger, and how he was actually getting a blockage from the leftover zinkish debris that was picking up metals or whatever, probably a lot of calcium from the salt water, whatever, and that was a part of his blockage problem. So it's not necessarily, you know, just the impeller blades that wind up in the inlet side of the heat exchanger, but also wherever the zincs are. In fact, how many zincs do you actually have here? I see maybe 1, 2, 3 even, but
I only have one that I'm aware of, which is this one.
Yeah.
I see some potential other ports there, but also on a sort of a weird trajectory here, I had a big problem with my zincs disappearing very fast on my propeller shaft. And I noticed that when I started painting the propeller with the zinc-based paint, the spray paint you buy, which is great stuff, by the way, my zincs on my propeller shaft stopped eroding. They lasted like 4 times longer.
So it made your propeller a sacrificial propeller, or the coating on it?
No, the coating basically insulated the propeller itself. Was prevented from electrically drawing the zinc out of the zinc that's on the shaft. Is essentially what was happening.
Interesting. Okay.
Alex, hi, it's Frank. It's Frank. I'd like to say a few things.
Yeah, go ahead, Frank.
Okay, I have the very exact same heat exchanger, and I do have a Westerbeek mixing elbow. I changed that a few years ago. But if you could go back, I've got some great information on that water pump that the information that I got, I've never been able to find from any Perkins book or anything. And I was having a problem. You see the housing, the 4 bolts to the housing on the housing that hold the water pump onto the front of the engine. You see those?
Yeah, these ones.
Right
Oh,
there.
sorry.
Yeah, right there. And I have the key driving off the crankshaft. Correct. Well, I was having a problem. I was wearing out. My pump was having to be rebuilt almost every year. I was getting weeping constantly after a very short few hours of running it. And I couldn't figure out why. I had the pump rebuilt. I bought a new pump, and then it would wear out again. And I talked to a friend of mine, and I don't know where he got this information, but he told me when you put that pump on with that kind of a drive, see how it's a slotted, goes onto the crankshaft right on the very end on the shaft.
Yeah.
Okay. And all you want to do with those 4 bolts is mount that bolt, that pump onto the front of the engine, snug them up a little bit. Okay. Then you want to run the engine for maybe 5-10 minutes. What happens is that the drive on the crank can move the pump will self-center itself on that shaft. Do you follow me?
Yep.
If you clamp it down tight and it isn't exactly in the right position, you're going to wear out your bearings on your shaft, and your pump is going to leak. And since I've done that, once you told me that, I did it. I bolted the pump up, and I cranked the engine over, ran it for a few minutes, and then I put the torque to the proper torque. I've never had a problem with that pump since, and I was having a problem every year with it.
Wow, interesting.
It was something because I guess what happens is it goes into a minute elliptical shaft rotation.
Yeah, because off center.
It wears out the bearings.
Yeah.
But I've looked every time I'm on the Perkins website, I look for that information, and I have the Perkins shop manual. It never tells you that.
Interesting.
You're seeking concentricity.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
That's not something you would normally. I mean, when you replace the impeller, you don't have to undo those bolts, though, right?
No, correct. No, right. But once you start getting a weep on the shaft, then you've got to repair it. I would start getting salt water in my sump, my pump, in the bottom of the engine sump, and I would start looking for it, and then I'd find this drip, 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 drip when the engine's running. And I thought it, I'm
Good tip.
thankful to that guy every time I see him, because I look for that information. Anytime I'm on there, I look for someone talking about it, and I've never heard anyone say that.
Oh, thank you. Very interesting.
That worked, yeah.
Okay, I'll keep going. So then the various systems, we've talked about those. I'm going to clear that. And there's a control that will clear all the junk. Hang on a second. That'll teach me to use something for the first time. Okay. So we've got the fuel tanks, then they go to the filters, then you've got pumps, the distribution system to get the fuel to the 4 cylinders or 3 cylinders, the fuel injectors, which are the focus of this chat, and then the return and the fuel line. The banjo is this cool little device you'll see in a picture, which pulls the fuel together and distributes it off. So here's the beginning. And thanks to Darrell for teaching me a great deal about this today, which I didn't know. So the fuel comes into this actually through, I think it's through one of these hoses here is the input. And this is in my case, this is the cartridge fuel filter, which can be replaced. In the earlier model, there's this cylindrical one. We were talking about that a little earlier. And then this little doohickey down here, this little square doohickey is the fuel pump. And here's the input to it, and it pumps the fuel electrically, which I hadn't realized. This is a filter, and the key thing is the filter has a hand prime pump on top of it, this plunger, and one releases a screw on top of this to bleed the system. You release a screw on top of this and then pump this down. I tried to pump it when I was down on the boat a week or two ago, and it was rock solid, and that's why I called Westerbeek, and he said, well, did you release the screw? I said, no, I was just seeing how it behaved. He said, well, with the screw not released, you're going to have pressure in there because from the last time you ran it, it'd be full. So it's going to be hydraulic lock. So that's the next test I have to do. So that was a dumb thing not to do. I'm going to pause there because I know, Darrell, you've got some comments about this area you wanted to discuss.
Not too much. You got it pretty well covered there. But yeah, down at the bottom, you see a picture of a cylindrical style electric fuel pump. The older engines had those, I guess. They've gone mostly now to this cube-shaped electric pump. These are all made by Facet, a company up in Elmira, New York, or somewhere up there. And they've been doing that since the 50s, and they were called Bendix way back when. And they make some great pumps and a great variety. And I actually changed my engine from a mechanical fuel pump on the Yanmar to an electric cube-style Facet electric pump. And I'm happy for it. I've kept the old pump for in case of an emergency with the electric pump, but I love the electric because you can just turn it on while you're bleeding. You don't have to be, you don't have to be the ape operating the handle on the mechanical pump. It makes life quicker and easier, and for most of us now, of course, Alex's engine here is self-bleeding type, so his bleeding efforts are minor compared to most of us. But I just want to mention that.
Yeah, I have the long cylindrical one at the bottom, that one.
Okay.
I'd like to make a suggestion.
As a Yanmar owner who was bleeding this afternoon, I wish I'd known about this.
If someone wanted to make a suggestion, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to make a suggestion. When I first got the boat, with my Totten 33, it had the Universal 5424 diesel in it, and came with an electric fuel pump. And some wise old soul somewhere said, buy a spare electric fuel pump, keep it in its box, don't open it up, don't touch it. Someday you're going to need it. Sure enough, 20 years later, I had the fuel pump went on me somewhere, I don't know where, but I was able to swap it out and got the engine started without any problem. So that's one of the spares that is a good idea to have on board boat with you all the time.
Excellent. Great tip.
One thing I forgot, Alex, on the cylindrical pumps, since Michelle says she has one, there is a filter at the bottom there. You untwist the ring at the bottom of that cylinder, and out drops this, it's a screen type thing. It's not a paper element. It's like a polyester screen, and it's like 75 microns or something. So it's basically just along for the ride, I call it. It's not doing anything. The pump is protected by your primary filter anyways, but it's there, and you probably should have a spare with the spare gasket just in case something goes haywire there.
Good point.
Quick question. Anybody else have a Volvo?
Deafening silence.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'll continue then. So then here's after the fuel pump, the fuel comes in, I think it's this connection here, if I remember correctly. This is the distributor, which has 4 fuel lines. So one comes in and 4 fuel lines go out to distribute it to the appropriate 4 injectors. You can see here. The main point I wanted to make about this particular slide, and you'll see it in the photograph, is when I came to remove these injectors, I had to also remove or loosen at least all of these fuel lines. So I couldn't, the fuel lines are probably 1/4 inch copper, solid, and they're screwed in solidly to the injector. So everything is immovable initially. Loosening these didn't do much good because it was being held in place by this. So I realized I'd have to loosen these. Loosening that didn't do a lot of good because not very far away, they were all bolted into the fuel pump, into the distributor rather. So I had to remove them from here, or loosen them at least, loosen this plate that was holding them, and then I could undo these and lay them to one side. I also had to loosen these clamps. That made me quite nervous because obviously I was going to have to get them in the right place. So before I did anything, I always do this now, and I recommend this to anyone who does any mechanics that they're not totally familiar with. I take lots and lots of pictures. You'll see a few of them in a minute. But particularly, I wanted to make sure I got the order of these pipes connected. Now, because they're mechanically bent to shape, these aren't flexible pipes, they're very rigid. Realistically, you couldn't put them in the wrong place and bolt them down sensibly. You'd have to bend something. So, but I wanted to know that I had the right pipe going to the right place out of the box, because it was going to make my life a nightmare if I accidentally mix 2 of these up. And as you'll see, it was a very difficult area to work in. I could barely get to the back 2 with my fingers. And you're going to have the right wrenches and small wrenches. You're moving 1/8 of a turn at a time. I couldn't get any ratchet on here or anything. So that was the fiddliest part, I would say, of the operation, of undoing this and being able to get the injector, these pipes off the injectors and far enough away. I had to get a large 17mm socket onto these injectors. Well, that's another point I was going to mention, is on the Westerbeek, to my dismay, the boat, the Beneteau, obviously is a French boat. It was built down in South Carolina, as I recall. I think that's right. And it's a mixture all over the place between imperial sizes and metric. So I have to carry both imperial and metric sockets and open ends and, on the boat. And even coming down to the engine, which I thought, well, at least the Westerbeek is made in America, it'll be all imperial. It wasn't. The fuel injectors were metric, which surprised me, but all of the piping was imperial. And indeed, to undo many of the pipes up here, you can't quite see it. There's a place where, oh, here it is, the banjo fuel line. There's a connection here that's just almost out of sight behind these. And you've got to have 2 wrenches to be able to undo that. And they both had to be imperial, and I had to go scrabble around to make sure I could find 2 of those smaller sizes. So I'm going to pause there. Darrell, just ask your comments on that. Is that something you've come across on most boats, or is it unique to my situation?
Yeah, I mean, the engine is a Japanese engine made by Mitsubishi, I believe. And it's basically, a small truck engine. And that's why it has this distributor type fuel pump. Distributor type fuel injection pump. Because they have the capability of altering the timing, which you don't have with the more common jerk pumps. Well, the name is kind of funky, but the jerk pumps have individual plungers for each cylinder, whereas this has one actual pump, but that's then distributed out to all 4 cylinders. But they can tweak the timing based on engine RPM. So these are capable of running at, 4,000, 4,500 RPM, where most diesels have a fixed timing and have a limited range. But while you're on this slide, Alex, maybe you want to also touch base on the fuel return piping and how your plan is on how you're going to bleed it, because you haven't done that yet, and I'm curious to know where you're going to be loosening things.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so the fuel injectors have the inflow here and here and here, and I'll mention just on that a detail on the fuel injectors. When I came to unbolt it, visibly to me, there was two nuts. There's a big nut at the bottom and a slightly smaller nut just above it. And I had to do some research to find out which one I undid, because I didn't want to undo the wrong one. Well, the upper nut is what actually holds the whole fuel injector assembly together, including the spring and the nozzle and all the rest of it inside. So that is a definite no-no. Fortunately, I didn't attempt to undo that. So I don't undo things unless I know what I'm doing. It's the bigger nut on the outside is the one that I undid. When one does that, one also has to be very careful that one finds the washers that are the copper washers that are down inside the barrel or inside the casting rather. They're tough to see, and the instructions said make sure you retrieve those copper washers. You're going to put in new ones, but don't accidentally leave one in there without paying attention. So that's the input. Then the output of the fuel injector is this return line. So you can see there's one long return line here with 4 holes in it. These are called banjos. They're circular, as you can see, obviously. And what's so clever about them is that they get fuel anywhere around them. So this washer underneath actually has a couple of holes in it, a couple of tiny holes. And that goes on top of here, and that's sealing the top of the fuel injector. And the thing is, the reason that's needed is because on a diesel engine, the more fuel is provided than is required. And that's how basically the throttle works. So there's a lot of fuel that isn't used by the fuel injector and gets returned. And that's very common. I think all diesels, as far as I know, work like that. So this line here is critical in returning the fuel. So you see it brings it all together, comes down here, and then it drops down here and then goes back to the return line. And it actually goes to a rubber pipe that goes off them back to the fuel tank. And I might have mentioned in the previous session this banjo broke right here when I was at Cuddy Hunk. And I woke up one morning and found my bilges full of diesel. And it turned out that the pipe had been secured incorrectly by a previous maintenance person. And so every time the engine torqued, it was putting full load on that particular tiny fitting. The pipe should have been attached to the engine so that the whole lot moved with the engine and no load was put on here. That isn't what happened. So that was a catastrophe in the making. Any other comments on that? Oh, we want to talk about bleeding, you said, Darrell. Yeah, so having bled the fuel pump, which we talked about earlier, what I've now been told to do is reattach everything, but make sure that these 4 screws that hold the incoming pipes are slightly loose. Do them up and then back off quarter of a turn. They don't have to be loose, but just slightly loose so they can dribble, literally. The interesting thing is then they said, go and turn the engine over for maybe 15, 20, 30 seconds, preferably with someone else doing it. So you can watch the fuel come out of these 4 nozzles and you'll see bubbles. And then once the bubbles have gone and it's just coming out clear as a clear stream, then you lock these down very quickly and you've bled the system. So I was concerned about doing this. And I think in the previous session we had, I mentioned that I was going to do this when I was back in the water because I was worried about the engine starting, not having any water to cool the engine, blah, blah, blah. When I was talking to the guy at the Westerbeek Maintenance, he said, you've got no chance of starting the engine, Alex. He said, those fuel injectors are set up for 2000 PSI before the little needle will open. I have some photographs in a minute, I'll show you. He said, so as soon as you crack that fuel pipe open, you're releasing the pressure. That's why it's bleeding. There's no way you're going to get 2000 PSI in the fuel injector, so the engine isn't going to even attempt to start. So he said, in fact, when he's maintaining the fuel injectors, he wants to make sure that either it's on the hard, he prefers to do it that way, so there's no chance of water getting in the engine, or what I also learned was that he then shuts off the water intake, the cooling raw water intake. And I said, well, why do you do that? He said, because if I'm turning the engine over, and the water pump has water, it's the boat's in the water and it's getting access to raw water. That raw water is being pushed into the exhaust, into that 90-degree elbow we talked about, or almost 90-degree elbow. And normally, and this, Darrell, I appreciate you explaining this because I hadn't understood this subtlety, it is the engine exhaust that pushes that water out over that 90-degree elbow and out of the boat. If you don't have the engine running and you keep on cranking that key, that raw water pump's going to put too much water into that exhaust and can potentially go back into the engine. I'm going to stop there and ask Darrell to just fill in because that's all somewhat new to me. So I want to make sure I'm telling the right story there, Darrell.
Yeah, you're close. You pretty much, you know, you're filling the muffler basically with water, and without engine exhaust to blast it out of the muffler, it just sits in there and builds up, and the elevator and just keeps climbing. But back to that screen again, Al. I just want to mention
just want to show the muffler here, just to make sure we're really clear on that for everyone. So it's this part here with the blue arrow that we're filling up, right, Darrell?
That's the elbow. That's just your mixing elbow.
Okay.
What you see there is the hose that goes to the muffler from there. Muffler is a big can, about a, you know, like 2-gallon fiberglass bucket typically, and that's where the muffler is. And if the water backs up into this elbow, it can get into the engine via an open exhaust valve in the exhaust manifold there.
Right.
There's a, does anybody use the kind of like the ears, the muffler, in order to flush the engine when you're doing your end of season freshwater flush through the intake? If you're pushing water through the intake and you don't have the engine started, that same thing happens and you end up backing up water into the cylinders.
Yes, but you can, no, I mean, if you have a drain on most mufflers, right? So you could always open that and let the water drain from the muffler, poke a screwdriver in there too. But it takes quite a lot of water to actually climb back up into that exhaust manifold, depending how far down your muffler is, how big it is, etc. But for an engine like this, your typical muffler would be about a 2-gallon size.
Yes, but if you're flushing it, you are putting a lot of volume in, and so that's something to be careful with.
Good point.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, you should never put any like garden hose or anything. I mean, when flushing can be just cranking the engine over or whatever. But back to that other photo, if you could, Al.
This one?
Oh, yeah. I would just want to touch base, if you want to handle this, I mean, the question of the return line. So you got a return line and you got a suction line from the tank. You have to coordinate those if you have multiple tanks. And you guys with big boats, you may have 2 or 3 tanks for all I know.
So what do you mean by coordinate, Darrell? Because I only have 1 tank, but even so.
Well, I think these guys know what I'm talking about. You only have 1 tank, Al, but
yeah.
Some of these boats, I know Michelle's boat has more than 1 tank, and she probably has valving to direct both the suction and the leak off or return line. Okay, so you need to keep those coordinated so that you're pulling from the same tank as you're feeding back to.
Yeah, Darrell, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I had on my old boat, I had 3 tanks, but 1 was the primary tank and the other 2 I fed to and fro from the main tank with a line pump. So I only had the return line going to the main tank, but the auxiliary tanks would just feed the main tank whenever I needed to kind of replenish that. So I didn't have there's no coordination issue in that regard.
Yeah, but some people do have multiple tanks that they suck from, and you got to make sure you're blowing from the same tank you're sucking from.
Well, I have the 2 tanks and I have 2 return lines. And when we first got the boat,
it wasn't terrible, but it was okay. This is a shot. There's another picture later of the filter, cartridge fuel filter, and there's the little dome that I have to press to prime it. So I'll be doing that sometime soon. Slow me down if anyone has questions on these. Otherwise, I'm just going to go through them fairly quickly. This is to show you how difficult it was to work on those 4 fuel lines and release them. So they're hidden down here. There's 1, there's 2, there's 3. You can see this one is undone. And there's another one at the back here that I could barely see. The clamp is off. That's why the paint's missing. One thing I do want to mention is I was warned and read in all the various places about maintenance is one has to be immaculately clean with this. And what the issue for me was the paint, the engine had been sprayed by a mechanic at my request some time ago. So everywhere had paint on it, and the paint is just a thin spray paint, so it's easy to scrape off. And if you look down here where this fuel line is headed to go into here, there's a tiny, tiny speck of red. That's probably a little flake of paint that's come down from somewhere, could be anywhere. And any one of those could get stuck in a fuel injector and prevent it from working and stop it from working altogether. So I was advised to keep a vacuum. I have a vacuum I keep on the boat, a small electric vacuum. And I had that with me at all times. And every time I went near any of these places that were the high pressure return, I vacuumed before and after and during and really try to be immaculate. But time will tell when I come to start this puppy whether I was immaculate enough in keeping it really clean. Any suggestions or comments from anyone on that topic? As it's the first for me. Okay. Here's the view after I removed the fuel injectors. I very carefully plugged each of the 4 holes with wipes, the blue machinist towel. I put plastic bags over the lines so they wouldn't get crap in them. Again, trying to be really careful not to get any kind of contamination to those lines. Here's one of the 4 fuel injectors out, and look at the condition of it. That's 2,500 hours of burning. You can see the soot and the dirt. There's the tiny, tiny little needle that gets pushed back. And the issue is that all this carbon buildup, there's 3 things they do when they're testing the fuel injectors before they go clean them up, is they first will see what pressure they release at. And I did ask for all the data on my 4, and my 4 all released a little low. They should be around 2,000 PSI, and they were releasing 1,800, 1,700. And they weren't releasing evenly because the springs that cause the release had, got different wear levels on them. And so they were releasing slightly unevenly. And then the next thing they look at is the spray pattern. They make them intentionally spray, and look at the spray pattern. They have a tank they screw these into, and they can see on the side what the spray pattern looks like. And the spray pattern is supposed to be a very nice, even pattern, as you can imagine, coming out. So it really goes into an aerosol. And when you have this kind of carbon and junk around the nozzles, you're going to get blockages on one side. It's going to have more spray on one side than the other, all kinds of things. I mean, any number of things. So I found that very interesting. So now with these completely clean, I should get a perfect spray pattern, and they should evenly fire. Any comments from anyone on that before I move on?
Who did you send these to?
Well, interestingly, very quick story, and thank you for asking, Michelle. Our local Westerbeek main dealer is Hanson Marine out in Marblehead, as I'm sure you know. And I called them and said, can you service my fuel injectors? And they said, sure, it'll be, and I'm going to quote here, I think they said it was going to be $230 a fuel injector, something like that. So it would have been, I seem to remember it was going to come out to about $1,000 to get the 4 serviced. So I thought, wow, that's a lot. Let me check, what else I could do. I then, by chance, just looking on the web, found a place called fuelinjectors.com. And I looked at their website. They look credible. They do only fuel injectors. So it's the only thing they do for diesel engines, nothing else. And so I called them up, said, can you do these for a Westerbeek? And she said, oh yeah, Westerbeek, that's a blah, blah, blah fuel injector. Immediately knew what the model make was and the type, and said, oh, not a problem at all. So I drove it up there rather than mailing it. There was somewhere up near Manchester, I think. And saw the shop because I really wanted to see what was I doing leaving my fuel injectors, my precious fuel injectors, with these people I'd never heard of, and it was a very nicely set up shop, 4 people working there, and the woman who ran it was the wife and 2 dogs and all the rest of it. And I said, what's it going to cost me for this service? She said, well, if you're picking up and delivering, it'll be $30 a fuel injector, please.
That's more like it.
So what did you decide?
Well, it was a tough decision, Darrell, but I decided I'd cheap out and go with this. Now, of course, I still haven't run the engine, so I don't know that, I could turn around and regret it bitterly, but I doubt it. So there's my 4 fuel injectors ready to go. Turned out I didn't need to number them. I was just being cautious, and the guy who serviced them said, no, they're all identical. It doesn't matter where they go. I am going to put them in the same place because I do know the numbering. I noticed they're all nicely painted, very dirty here. And they also came out very well, I should mention, because there's diesel fuel, which is nice lubricant. Some people warn me that the fuel injectors can get stuck and it can be a hell of a job. These cracked open really nicely and just screwed out with my fingers. So I was thrilled with that. That was my big worry. Here's what they looked like when they came back. I was very impressed when I picked them up. All completely shot blasted or whatever they did, completely clean, new seals we talked about, covers over them. There's the puppies nicely in. They're not painted, but who cares? They're all assembled. These are slightly loose, so that I can bleed them and look for the drips. There's my fuel pump primer. I'm ready to go. And with that, any questions? I'm going to hand over to Darrell. But any questions first?
Yeah, I have a question for you. Was the injectors the sole part of this project, or was there any need to look into the actual injector pump itself?
I decided not to go there. I was advised that the injector pump was something you definitely only want to have an expert do with a shop.
Right.
I asked the guy who serviced the injectors, did he service fuel pumps? He said, yeah, I can do your pump for you. He said, but I would recommend we don't. He said, get your injectors in. He said, fuel pumps are pretty reliable. See how it runs. If you think you got a problem with the fuel pump, by all means, bring it to me, but let's not go there until it's necessary.
And are all Westerbeek set up with that kind of distributor pump that you described earlier?
I'm afraid I don't know. I only have
didn't
experience
realize
with mine.
that.
Yeah. Michelle,
No,
sorry, Darrell, go ahead.
no, they're not. But it's based only engines about 50 horsepower, 4 cylinders. Some of the big Westerbeeks and most all your Perkins of that size range too. The 4107, all those they're based on like a taxi cab engine, if you will, and these are not just your basic industrial engines. So they tended to have this distributor type fuel injection, which is more expensive, I think, to actually make.
So my old 30 horse probably doesn't have it.
Right. You won't find it on engines less than 4 cylinder, as far as I know.
Okay, mine's a 3. Okay.
Yeah, mine's
Thank you.
64 horsepower, if that helps. So something I didn't realize, Darrell, I think you mentioned that this wasn't made by Westerbeek. I had naively assumed that Westerbeek was actually the company that made this engine. You said it's Japanese?
They never made engines, actually. They started off marinizing Perkins engines, and eventually they moved on to Mitsubishi blocks. And meanwhile, Universal went to also Japanese engines. Those are Kubotas. So one's using Mitsubishi and the other one's using Kubotas, if you will.
So which is mine, the Westerbeek?
You have a Mitsubishi engine.
Okay, because I've got a Panda generator and that has a Kubota on it. So that's nice to know I've got the pair. Cool. Okay, well, I'll stop sharing and I'll over to you, Darrell. Thank you so much, everyone. And I'll let you know how the engine does. We'll celebrate when it fires up.
Thank you.
Very nice. Mine won't be quite so organized, so we'll see how this goes here. I'm going to be pulling from a Word file, basic.
I always appreciate it when someone takes the mystery out of some of these things. It's great. Thank you.
Well, I hope I haven't bitten off more than I can chew, Dennis.
You'll find out.
Yeah. So far, I'm pleased to say everything's gone according to plan. So I'm optimistic. I didn't break anything. I didn't stress anything. So other than me being stressed out, I'm hoping it'll go okay. I'm just worried about those particles and any contamination. There we go.
Turn some lights on.
I think I need to unmute. Okay, that helps. Do you see a diesel engine here?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, and you see those orange lines and dots?
Yeah. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you for the feedback.
Can you make it bigger?
Yeah.
It's hard to see.
No,
No.
not really.
Okay.
Let's see here. This is a Westerbeek M35 actually, and this, as you can see, has the jerk type pump, meaning it has individual plungers forcing that 2000 PSI down these pipes. And I grabbed this because it was a good picture, really. But these orange lines and these orange dots are bleed points. And this engine probably doesn't have what Alex's engine has, which is, you know, self-bleeding properties. And so you have to start from the beginning. And I sort of drew in a stupid lift pump here. Everybody see the yellow lift pump?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And I threw in a secondary filter, which on this engine is probably on the opposite side. This engine actually probably has an electric fuel pump on the opposite side of the engine. So I'm just sort of making it up as we go here. And so I'm going to go through a little exercise here, but right now I'm just showing this. We're not going to read this or anything. I'll send this out later to you folks if you want to take a look at it. But I just wanted to throw this in here because this shows a detail of how these fuel injectors actually work. They're both a spring-loaded valve and a spray nozzle. So they do multiple things and do it well, but they don't, like Alex was saying, they don't open until you get somewhere on the curve of the profile for fuel pressure that comes out of the fuel injection pump. So you might be starting at 1000 PSI, they're closed until they get up to say 1800 PSI. The valve starts opening and then it gets fully open, and then, you know, it's just like climbing the top of a mountain in terms of the pressure. Then it starts to fall off and then the valve closes, is my best understanding on this matter. So I'm just going down the list here. Can you see this stuff well enough? I have no idea. So these are really just my notes to bring up topics, but basically I'm going to cover the matter of this drawing shows a fuel shutoff valve here. This is right out of the Beta Marine. By the way, Beta uses Kubota engines for the most part, and they're a British company. They each have this in their installation drawing for their engines in general, and this shows a mechanical lift pump. And what else can I show you? A very standard, very basic filter here for your primary filter. And there's a drain for the water and all that, but otherwise it's just very basic. There's no pump to it. There's no integral pump to it. There's no bowl that you can see through. It's just, you know, very basic. Here the fuel injectors are in this case. You don't really see it very well, but these are daisy chained for the fuel feedback. But notice, I just noticed this for myself actually, there's a feedback connection to the fuel injection pump. That may or may not exist. But I think they may have a valve. I know in Alan's engine, there's a valve on that Kubota on Alan's boat that you can open for the final stage of bleeding. So instead of bleeding right here, you open this valve up, and what it does, it bypasses the fuel injection pump and pushes it right down the return line back to the tank. So all your air bubbles can wind up out here somewhere. And of course they dissipate in the tank and you're back to real fuel. But that's a great feature, but otherwise it's entirely standard routine, hands-on routine for bleeding. And so here's
Darrell, could I just ask you to touch on the fuel filters? I believe there's generally two. I know I have two on mine. What sizes and what that does?
Yeah. Well, the primary filter, of course, is to collect all the trash and the water and allow you to remove the water. So we can drain here. If there's any water at all, you want to know about it. So you drain here maybe once a month to see what's going on, maybe some condensation in your tank, whatever. Maybe you get a leaking fuel filler, who knows. So this is one type of filter, and there are many other types. A lot of people have the Raycor turbine series, which are larger, sizable things, and they are not bleedable. They don't have, you wouldn't have the red dot here if I was showing you one of the turbine, and I'm going to show you a picture of one later. But those you have to fill up manually by yourself after you service it. You have to fill it either from the tank somehow. You're lucky if you have gravity feed, or you have to have a jug that you pour diesel fuel from into the filter body until it's nearly full. And in this case, air stays behind, but it's way up high because it's unlike these guys. The actual port going out of the filter is fairly low down. So the air is floating at the top and cannot get out. And it's a weird concept to imagine that you don't bleed a filter, but man, it had me bamboozled for a while.
Hey, Darrell.
Yeah.
I had a Ray car on Satisfaction, and it did have a bleeding valve on the top of the filter, so I was able to bleed it.
Yeah, most you can bleed, but the turbine series, which is, and this is an example of a turbine right here. See the T handle?
Yeah.
That top lid, you don't put that on until that thing is full. And then you seal that top lid and you're done. There's no bleeding. Some air is going to be in there for sure, not much. You don't want too much in there. If you start seeing air down in here somewhere, you're in trouble. But so that's one. These are about twice the size of these over here.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're big.
Yeah, they are big.
These are designed for basically 100 horsepower, 150 horsepower engines, but a lot of people will have it on a 35 horse, diesel. I don't know why, but they do. But they are, once you understand them and how to service them, they're easy. The filters are cheap and they can handle a lot of crap. So if you got fuel problems, it's a good thing to have. But here on my boat, I got this little guy. This is the smallest one they make. It does 15 gallons per hour. 15 gallons per minute. Sorry.
No.
Per hour, right?
Yeah.
Per hour. It has to be per hour. And for diesel, it's also used for gasoline. But anyways, it's a great filter. And you have to unscrew this whole bowl, and it drops down. And first you drain it partially, and but to vent it is right here. That's the vent when you're bleeding. And so that's like a paper element that goes in there. These are called the spin-on series, and they've got a whole bunch of these, some with pumps like you see here. This is a plunger pump, and others have a push button or push push with your hand type button for the bigger models. So this is the 200 series and the 400 series are the bigger ones. And again, you got the clear bowl and the drain. But you turn that drain open, what's going to happen? Nothing. Because you got to let air in to get fuel out. Unless you have a way of pumping fuel into it, it's going to it has to exchange that fuel for something, So yeah, if you get a gravity feed from the tank or whatever, fuel can come in while you're draining fuel, but otherwise you may have a, sort of a dilemma there. You might have to actually open the bleed valve in order to get the fuel out of here. And by the way, this is 3 sections. This is the top section. Here's the filter section. It's a metal canister. These are all gasketed together, and then you got this bowl at the bottom. And so you got to have the right tools, strap wrenches, and these have to be well mounted because it takes a lot of force to get these puppies apart. And that goes for this guy too. I had to put some metal behind the bulkhead to take the force of, uncranking this with a wrench. But let's get back to our exercise here. We had a leak in our fuel valve, okay, and so we had to change that. In the process, you can see the black dots in here, indicating a mix of air and fuel, and this is wide open, no air in this guy. This is your dip tube, we call it. I'm sure there's or standpipe, some people might call it. But this is about how we're sucking the fuel out of the tank. It's got to come up and over. You got to get it up and over to this point before you actually have a gravity feed siphon. But what's that gaining you? Nothing, because this filter's up high. If the filter's down low, it's a good thing in some cases. So I had to change this, and now we've got all this air in here. So we got to pull that air out of there. So who wants to start? What are we going to do? Leo, how about you? What do you think?
Well, to start, I certainly would charge my, what do you call it? The electric fuel pump. I would start there and then bleed from the electric fuel pump.
Now, wait a minute. Let me just fill everybody in here, Leo. Leo, instead of a manual pump here, he's got an electric fuel pump on the engines he's familiar with. So that's all he's saying is he would actually turn on electrically his fuel pump. I think that's what you're saying, Leo.
Yes, that's right.
Now, that's going to suck air and fuel. How are we going to get the air out?
It's pushing it.
Well, wait a minute. It's sucking it.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
You start at the fuel tank and then you work yourself to the engine. This is a little bit, I'm sorry, I wasn't looking at, and my dog was barking his head off upstairs, so thank God for mute. But no, the fuel pump actually started at the engine and at the fuel tank rather, and it was pulling fuel out of the fuel tank, pushing it again through the Raycor, and then from the Raycor pushing it through the primary paper filter and into the injector pump.
Okay, Leo, hold on now. You're on a little different track because you're describing an auxiliary fuel pump that was installed at the fuel tank.
Yeah.
Not what we're showing here.
No, it's a little different. But that's the way mine was. But go ahead. I'll pass on this then.
Yeah, we're going to have to drop you off because you have the ability to cheat, so we can't have you describing this. How about you, Bruce? Can you help us out?
Let me tell you that
yes,
cheating is absolutely a fantastic pleasure in this case.
Yes, with my Yanmar, I was doing exactly this afternoon. I had changed both the filter in the Raycor and the secondary filter on the engine. So I was operating that little lift pump with its lever down there that you have an arrow on with my little fingers. And you can get your fingers tired if it's not working for you quickly. But first I found a bleeding screw on the primary fuel water separator and worked there and closed that.
Okay, can I hold you for a second, Bruce?
Yeah.
Was your primary filter, in other words, this orange dot, what was the elevation of that relative to the fuel level in the tank?
I think it's a little bit lower than we see in this picture because I've never had to worry about getting fuel to there.
So you have a gravity feed, at least when your tank is full.
Essentially, yes. And so I correct myself. I don't believe there's a bleeding port on the primary fuel water separator. So what I do is on my fuel lift pump, there is places where you can bleed. So I pump and pump and pump, and I look to get bubbles and then a steady stream of fuel at my bleeding point on that little pump. And when I do that, okay, I close it. And now I've also changed the secondary fuel filter on the engine itself. So there, you've got a little orange dot there. Similar for me, there's a place where you can bleed there. And I did that until I got a steady stream of fuel. And then I actually go farther forward to the fuel injector port pump. And you can, there is a bleeding screw there. I must admit this afternoon, I only got bubbles and not a steady stream, and I was unhappy with that. So that's why I'm listening here tonight. Over.
So you're not done. You're not done bleeding then?
I don't know. I'll go back having looked at all this. Now I've done this 25, 30 times. This is 32nd year for this boat. And it's never failed to start in the water. It's never failed to start on the hard. So I can either go and scratch myself to death or just put the batteries on board tomorrow and give it a crack and see what happens.
Okay. How about Dennis or Tom? Do you guys have any suggestions here?
Darrell, could I just jump back and say you said you started your boat on the hard. Can you just talk to me about that? Because I'm always paranoid. I'm going to, not let the engine cool. How long do you run it for on the hard?
Well, I disconnect the raw water intake from the seacock and put it in a bucket and lead the garden hose to the bucket and supply water to the engine as long as I want to run it.
Oh, okay. Because someone told me that because diesels are big cast iron castings, you can run them safely without the raw water impeller, which is neoprene, would melt. But without that, you could run a diesel engine for, say, 30 seconds quite safely. Is that a true statement? Did anyone disagree with that?
I'd agree.
Yeah.
I'd agree with that.
Okay.
The problem with your big engines is that they suck so much water. They pump like 15 gallons a minute or whatever. I don't know. You can fill a couple of bathtubs before the engine gets a chance to really run.
Right.
So
Yeah.
One trick there is if you can restrict the outlet side by compressing the hose, the outlet side of the raw water pump, things can be a little more manageable. You don't have to have the garden hose going full blast constantly.
Yeah. I think I'll wait till I'm launched. Yeah. Sorry for the interruption.
Half or a third blast on the garden hose is more than adequate for me.
Yeah, I do the garden hose approach too in a 5-gallon bucket, and it works fine. Just as long as I need to go to get it up to temperature to change the oil.
And Dennis, what kind of engine do you have?
I got a Westerbeek M30, I think, or 25. It's a 3-cylinder, 30 horse. And I have an electric fuel pump. So like Bruce, I don't have to worry too much about that, but I have a bleed port at the filter, the secondary filter, and also at the injection pump, at least, and maybe other places too that I haven't had to look at yet. But I've got one of the whatever you call it, turbine rakors, and it's never been an issue just to open up the top of that, put in a new filter canister, let it fill up, and put the thing back on, and just kind of clean up the mess.
So you have a gravity feed to the rakor then?
Or it's through the pump.
Oh, you have a pump ahead of the primary.
Electric pump ahead of the rakor.
Oh, so
Yeah.
You and Leo had something in common there, because that is abnormal. But that's an auxiliary addition. You have an actual engine pump, which is about where this guy is located, between the two filters. Is that accurate? So you had two electric pumps then?
I'm not sure. This boat is still kind of new to me in this regard, but I know the one, and I know that in fact, I had 2 rakors. One was kind of disconnected, so I just got rid of that, got it out of the way. But yeah, so I have to have 2, I guess, one on the engine and one auxiliary. Yeah.
Well, okay, I don't want to torture you folks too much here, but this is what's the problem. You can't open this valve while you're pumping here, and the reason is you've got suction rather than pressure. We want pressure greater than atmospheric in order to open any bleed valve. So if you open this valve while you're pumping, what's going to happen? You're going to suck in more air. You're not going to push out air. So that's not good. So what we have to do in this case is just pump away and use the next bleed valve, which is here at the secondary filter. Open that puppy up, put a bucket under it, and pump and pump and pump until you get a couple of quarts of fuel, which you can probably recycle, run it through a coffee filter or whatever, back into the tank with a funnel later if you keep things clean. And you got to get that air out. That's really the best way to get it. And then you can simply make the decision to go from there. Do I want to bother hitting the fuel injection pump inlet to also bleed a bit there, just to make sure everything's hunky-dory? That's optional. The whole idea here is let's avoid at any cost. Alex is an exception, but let's avoid at any cost the need to bleed
Right.
high pressure side, because first of all, it's a pain in the neck. Secondly, you don't want your fuel injection pump running without a good load of fuel, because that's the lubricant. And this is extremely precise fittings in there. The plungers there's no piston rings. It's just metal on metal. And without that full supply of lubricant, you can wear the thing out. So be kind and keep fuel.
So Darrell, on my old boat, which had a Volvo, it had right at the secondary filter, it had like a little hand, like rubber diaphragm squeegee thing with a little screen right ahead of that. And is that typical, or is that not for at the secondary?
Well, that's exactly what Alex has on his engine, as we just saw. His secondary filter has the only manipulatable pump in his system. The electric pump can only turn on when the engine's running, because it goes through an oil pressure switch. So they threw in, and that's sort of an automotive, a roadway scenario where you have a filter with a priming pump built into it on the secondary. We're looking at primary filters with priming pumps, because they're more needed in a boat situation. But on a car or a truck, you will often find these filters with a thumb push or whatever, like you described, a diaphragm, looks like a diaphragm, a push button that you can operate. And that's to let you bleed basically. Well, I'm sorry, you can bleed right here. The pump is actually upstream of the filter itself. Keep that in mind, especially also for primary filters. The pumps they have are upstream, okay? And therefore you can open the valve on the filter you're pumping at.
Right. Right.
But you can also use it to pressurize here at the fuel injection pump inlet. Again, low pressure. This is all low pressure stuff here. And it's a lot more fun playing with low pressure than high pressure.
Yeah.
Can I make a suggestion?
Sure.
Or an observation, I think, which is probably more logical. You always start at bleeding, you always start at the fuel tank first, the first connection beyond the fuel tank, which would be the ray core. In my case, it was the ray core. Then the next one would be the primary fuel filter. And then the next would be the line going into the fuel injection pump. I have, in the 30 years owning the boat, I've never had a problem with going that route. You can't go the other way, because obviously you're going to fill your air, you're just fighting against the tide there. So fuel tank, ray core, primary fuel filter, the fuel injection. And if I can add one more thing, is I was once told by a mechanic, never, never, never touch the injectors, because once you touch them, there's so much garbage and crap and everything else that you may dump a little bit of dirt and so forth in where the injectors go, and you're going to have trouble from then on. So as a result, I never touch the injectors.
Let me just add one more thing here. Backing up to the fuel tank, at the dip tube. Darrell, if you want to move your cursor over to the mouth, the dip tube, way down in there at the very end, way down there. Yeah. On my boat, when I first bought it used, I discovered that Pearson, in their wisdom, had a little tiny metal strainer in the mouth of that tube. And you let a little water get into your fuel tank, and algae will grow. Now, if you've ever left home for 6-8 weeks or whatever, you may come home and find a film of algae on the bowl of your toilet. Well, that is a film that, if sucked across that screen at the mouth of your dip tube, will effectively strangle your engine. No fuel. So when the engine dies, you fool with filters, you fool with this, you fool with that. Go make a ham sandwich. Either of them works because the algae film falls away from the mouth there. The suction has diminished and you can start her up again. But guess what? It's going to happen all over again. You got to get that screen out of there.
Lovely.
Yeah, the goal should be to get the algae to the primary filter. At least then you can see it. It's amazing how much junk you can have in the tank, and you actually won't see it in a clear fuel bowl on the primary filter because you're drawing the fuel so slowly until you're out there in a seaway and it gets churned up, all the foliage and garbage, and that can really block things up. And that's what happened to Alan actually. This is all on top of his tank, and the piping got clogged up on the top of his tank. We couldn't understand why is this all this suction? We were literally pulling air bubbles into the bowl of the primary filter because it's a clear filter. I'm on the phone with them. They can see bubbles coming in. Holy mackerel! How can that be? Well, we found out later because the mechanic found a plug in there. It looked like spinach, literally, and I don't think it smelled that good though. And so in the process of cleaning up that plug, a lot of air got into his long fuel line, and it was a bit of a chore to get all that out. But to Leo's point, yeah, to first of all, to Bruce's point, yeah, you really don't want a screen down here on the tip of this dip tube. And by the way, this shows a drain. This is the sort of the what they do in the UK, maybe, I don't know. You'll never find a drain plug in the bottom of a tank in the US that I know of, unless it's custom made. But it'd be nice to have. But yeah, the dip tube is something that can get plugged, or you could get plugged at the valve, wherever the restriction is going to be. If you get any foliage in this tank and it sucks it up, you don't know where it's going to get plugged.
Hey, Darrell, one of my mechanics that worked with me years ago suggested that every year he had a very tiny little spoon on the end of a long shaft, and he'd like to go down to the bottom of the fuel tank through the inspection port to just take out a sample. Any thoughts about that suggestion?
Well, I can, if I could add to that, that would be great. What I did is I did a little bit of an invention. I took a little plunger and put a hose on the end, on the suction end of it, took a dowel and took the hose and put it on the dowel, opened up the top of the inspection hole on the tank, put it down until I hit on the bottom of my tank was a little bit of a bowl, an indent in the bottom of the fuel tank. And I was able to actually use the suction and just squeeze it and pull out fuel and pull out the sludge and so forth. So it worked for me. Just a hint that may work for somebody else.
Does anybody polish their tanks? People don't
Yes.
polish their tanks?
Yeah. In fact, yeah, I did on Santim regularly. I haven't had to do it on this tank yet, but what we did on Santim on that tank, if you have room on the top of it, I would at least recommend you think about this, is we had a about a 4-inch diameter, 5-inch diameter port installed on the top of the tank, as close as possible to the where the line goes out, the fuel line goes out of the tank. And it was just fantastic because you could open up that port and just look right inside and see what's going on. And you could stick a little vacuum tube down there and suck out any algae or water that you could see down there. It was just fantastic.
Yeah, you're lucky if you have a actual inspection plate on the top of the tank. I know some of your larger boats will have that, and they have 20 bolts going around the circumference, and that is one way to go.
Yeah,
Allows
6
you
or
to
8, but yeah.
get your mitts in there too, clean up the tank. But most of us just have right here, is a 4-inch hose going right to the deck plate in the cockpit or something. And you're lucky if it's a straight shot in, because then you could have a portable kit that you hook up to your electrical system, and you could run it through a big filter with electric fuel pump and just polish your fuel on your own. You could do it that way, or you could have a built-in system. We're not going to get too far into the weeds here, but there's all kinds of ways to do this with multiple filters and whatnot. But a portable, people make their own portable setups. And in fact, I think I'll have an attachment in this actual document that I sent out to you that gives you a link to one of those examples, Michelle. But let's try to move on here, and I'll just say that Bruce makes the point. You want free flow, and you want to get that free flow to that filter. And sometimes you'll see these dip tubes are pretty hefty. They're not little 1/4-inch tubes or anything. They're maybe 3/8 inch copper tube or stainless steel tube or something. But they can always get plugged up if there's actual growth in there. So you got to keep track of that. And it, once a year, once every 5 years at least, you should probably stick a long copper tube down here attached to a little brass pump up in the cockpit and see what you got. Are you getting any water out of the very bottom of the tank? Because let's face it, the dip tube doesn't go there. The dip tube rarely goes to the very bottom of the tank. I wish it would. You want to get that stuff out. You don't want to leave it in there, but they don't. That's a problem. Okay.
Darrell, one more thing on that lift pump. That's a cam actuated pump, and you have that manual lever. If you go to pump that and you don't have enough travel on your manual pump, on the manual side of that, sometimes you have to crank the engine a little bit to get the cam.
That's right.
So that you'll never get enough travel on your manual pump. So you just crank the engine, just hit the button, don't start it, and then just pump if you need to get more travel on that pump.
Right.
You follow me? Yeah.
It's an eccentric, actually. It's actually a circle off center. So you need to turn at least 90 degrees of the cam, and that equates to 180 degrees on the crankshaft. So I put a wrench on my alternator, big nut on my alternator, a big adjustable wrench, and hold the belt while I slowly turn the engine. You want to go slow because you don't want it to start, right?
Well, it won't start if you get air in it.
Open the decompression valves.
Well, who said that?
I did.
Yeah, well, Bruce and I have decompression capabilities. I think most of the rest of these engines don't actually. The small Yanmar GM series, they have decompression, and they don't have electrical preheaters. So it's a little different mindset when it comes to cold weather starting, right, Bruce?
Starts up right away in any weather.
Okay.
I'm amazed.
Yeah, they are good.
Yeah. And today when I was doing this, I opened the decompression levers, no batteries on board. I just turned it by hand and done.
Yeah. By the way, I think we're both freshwater cooled engines, and we don't have the capability that they have with the saltwater cooled versions, where you can put the hand crank in there, a literal hand crank start, and it turns the crankshaft. So you get the crankshaft spinning. Now, mind you, the decompression makes the engine free to spin. So you crank away until you get the engine flywheel spinning fast enough, and then you flip the lever. There's one or two or three. you start flipping the levers to engage compression, and that's how you hand start these engines. That's what they use them in lifeboats that way. For example, you don't even need a battery. But I want to mention one more thing here before you go away from this dip tube ordeal, and that is right at this level. Doug Bayless, who was with us in Pelagic about 15 years ago, his boat had aluminum fuel tank and aluminum dip tube, and he had a Volvo 2003, I believe it was, and it would start to stall on him, but he finally figured out it's only when the fuel tank is half full or lower. And what was going on is this dip tube had a pinhole in it.
Mhm.
So as soon as the level got to like half full here, it would start to suck in air with fuel, maybe, or depending on the size of the pinhole, obviously. But he was smart enough and lucky enough that he could pull out his dip tube on his boat because the tanks were like under the settee, whereas some of us have tanks that are, you know what I mean, they're tall and skinny, and they're right up at the top, they're up close to the deck or whatever. I can't get my dip tube out of my tank. I could tilt my tank and maybe get it out. I know Alan's tank the dip tube can't come out of there. You got to be careful. You don't want to like break anything because it could be a nightmare to fix these things if you can't fix them. So you try to leave the dip tube alone if you can't really pull it out. Anyway, but just to finish up here, you have no choice. I'm sorry, Leo's lucky in that he's got somebody installed electric fuel pump at the tank, and that's unusual and not undesirable, but unusual. And maybe you have to leave that electric pump running all the time. I don't like that too much. But if you buy the right pump, certain pumps will free flow when they're turned on. Okay, so you can put electric pumps out here, and like some folks do. Dennis says he transfers fuel from one tank to another, probably with electric pump. I don't know. It's a wonderful thing. But to finish this off here, we got to get
Darrell?
We got to pull this air actually through this filter because we cannot pressurize out here. Correct, Leo? There's no way.
Oh, that's exactly right. But why is it, please clarify your comment on being desirable or undesirable to have the electric fuel pump so close to the fuel tank?
Well, electric fuel pump, to operate properly, it needs a filter because it doesn't take much grit to gum up the valving in a fuel pump. It's like a check ball in there and that sort of thing. So first of all, you have that's an auxiliary fuel pump we're talking about. It's not the lift pump.
No, it's an auxiliary fuel pump, and it's a cylindrical fuel pump, and
Okay.
yeah, it was inside the engine room versus where the tank was under the port quarter berth. And hey, in the 33 years or so that I owned the boat, the fuel pump, the electric fuel pump, I had to replace it once, and that was because of electrical failure, not the inability to get fuel through.
Well, we're not exactly sure where in the circuit your fuel pump was located, because what did you have? Was it a Westerbeek engine? I forget.
No, a universal 5424.
Same thing,
It was-
basically, isn't it?
I'm sorry?
I think it's basically the same engine, isn't it? The 5424 and the Westerbeek.
No,
No,
not at all.
Mine's pretty much the same. Yeah.
Yeah, the 5424 universal was a not an Oberdorfer, a tractor engine that was marinized.
It's a Kubota engine. And they would have originally had the fuel pump, the electric fuel pump here. They did not have a mechanical fuel pump. So somebody may have moved the circuitry so that the pump was out ahead of the primary filter, or or maybe you had a second pump operating actually. Some people actually have multiple pumps running. So it's hard to tell from here what exactly you had, Leo. But let's get back to this very basic. This is Beta Marine here. I mean, this is their 4-cylinder Beta Marine diagram. By the way, this I modified this drawing by moving this filter up higher to make the point that you cannot bleed this guy without a pump of some sort out here. That's the point of this whole discussion, really, is that you have to think, where can I bleed? I have to have pressure higher than atmospheric in order to open the system. Otherwise, you're just going to suck air in. So yes, you can add pumps out here. You can have a squeeze bulb, for example. Now, I don't want to get into the whole controversy. Oh, you can't have that. Oh, you know, it's illegal, whatever.
Yeah, the
Let's
beauty,
not go there. Let's not even discuss that at all right now, because it's a controversy that inside of a controversy. But you can have a pump built into this filter.
Hey, Darrell, we're getting into an hour and a half. I'm going to suggest we start thinking about shutting down the recording.
Okay. Yeah.
Just
That's probably. Why don't we do that now? Yep.
Yeah, I'll shut down the recording, everyone, and then we can carry on chatting as you want to. Unfortunately, I've got another meeting I'm going to have to go to, but just going to stop the recording now. Thanks so much for everyone contributing, and let's carry on chatting.
Okay. If you need a hand off to me, Al, you can do that.
Yeah, that would be good. I just got to figure out where to stop the recording.
Because I think we have some people here still hanging on for a few more minutes anyway.
Yeah.
I just gonna, very, very quick. One of the beauties of having an electrical pump charging all of your other everything is that you can turn on your ignition and listen to the click, 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 and open up and bleed. And when the clicking stops, you'll know that everything is in good shape.
Right.